Welcome back to another journey through the vast cosmos of science fiction. Tonight, we're descending through the atmosphere to humanity's scarred cradle, to a world where 30 billion souls struggle beneath compromised skies, where the greatest superpower in human history stands on foundations cracked by its own success. This is Earth in the Expanse, a planet that survived its own near-death experience, only to discover that survival comes with a price, measured in generations. Before we begin our exploration of humanity's wounded homeworld, if you find yourself drawn to these deep examinations of science fiction's most fascinating worlds, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content exploring the intricate universes that capture our imaginations. Now, let's begin our descent to Earth. The weight of 30 billion. Picture, if you will, a world drowning in humanity. Not in the oceans that have already risen to swallow coastlines, but in the sheer mass of human existence. 30 billion people. The number itself almost defies comprehension. To put this in perspective, our Earth in the early 21st century held around 8 billion people, and even that strained resources, infrastructure, and the planetary ecosystem to breaking points. The Earth of the Expanse has nearly quadrupled that burden. 30 billion heartbeats, 30 billion mouths to feed, 30 billion lives seeking meaning, purpose, employment, happiness, in a world that can no longer promise any of these things to the majority of its inhabitants. This is the fundamental reality of Earth in the 24th century, a world where success in extending human life and maintaining basic survival systems has created a demographic prison from which there seems no escape. When you first encounter Earth in the Expanse, whether through the television series or the novels by James S.A. Corey, you're immediately confronted with this overwhelming sense of scale. The opening title sequence itself tells a story that many viewers might miss on first viewing. It shows humanity's expansion into the solar system, yes, but pay attention to Earth in those sequences. Notice the seawalls surrounding New York City, the visible scars of environmental damage, the sheer density of human habitation spreading like a luminous infection across every landmass. This is not the Earth of optimistic science fiction, where humanity has solved its problems and reached for the stars from a position of triumph. This is Earth barely holding on, having survived catastrophic climate change through sheer desperate ingenuity, now facing a different kind of catastrophe. Too many people. Not enough purpose. The Earth we see in the Expanse serves as the beating heart of human civilization and simultaneously as its greatest failure. It remains, by every measure, the dominant superpower in the solar system. The United Nations that governs Earth commands the largest navy in human history. Fields armies numbering over 100 million soldiers, controls the most territory, and maintains diplomatic authority over humanity's far-flung colonies. Yet this power rests on increasingly unstable foundations. The planet itself, while stabilized from the worst effects of climate change, remains permanently scarred. More crucially, the society built atop these scars has calcified into a rigid hierarchy where the majority of citizens exist in a state of comfortable desperation, their survival guaranteed, but their futures foreclosed. This is the central paradox of Earth in the Expanse. It is simultaneously the strongest and weakest nation in human-controlled space. Strongest in terms of raw power projection, military might, and political influence. Weakest in terms of long-term viability, social cohesion, and the ability to offer its citizens meaningful lives. The planet has become a victim of its own success at survival, maintaining a population that it can keep alive but cannot truly sustain in any deeper sense. The world we're exploring tonight exists roughly 300 years in our future, though the exact timeline varies slightly between the novels and the television adaptation. By this point, humanity has spread throughout the solar system. Mars has been extensively colonized and has become an independent military power. The asteroid belt and the moons of the outer planets host millions of workers and settlers. Advanced fusion drives allow ships to traverse the distances between worlds in weeks rather than months or years. And through it all, Earth remains the seat of governmental power. The United Nations having evolved from an international organization into the unified government of humanity's homeworld and its satellite, Luna. But power, as the Expanse constantly reminds us, is contextual and temporary. Earth's dominance in the 24th century is less secure than it appears. Mars, though smaller in population, has focused all of its society's energy toward terraforming and military excellence, creating a technologically superior civilization that many believe could defeat Earth in a direct military conflict despite the numerical disadvantage. The belt, home to perhaps hundreds of millions of humans adapted to low gravity and vacuum, chafes under the economic exploitation that keeps Earth's vast population fed. And the opening of the ring gates, revealing thousands of potentially habitable worlds, threatens to make Earth's primary strategic asset, its massive population, into a liability, as those billions begin looking toward emigration as their path to better lives. Tonight, we're going to examine Earth in all its complexity. We'll explore how the planet arrived at its current state, the environmental near-catastrophe that forced global unification, the political structure that emerged from that crisis, and the society that has evolved over the following centuries. We'll look at the military power Earth projects throughout the solar system, the economic systems that barely sustain 30 billion people, and the political figures who navigate the treacherous waters of interplanetary diplomacy. And we'll witness the greatest catastrophe to befall Earth in the Expanse's timeline: the bombardment that killed billions and threatened to finish what climate change had started 2 centuries earlier. This is a story about the fragility of civilization, about how even the mightiest can fall, and about the terrible price of survival when survival becomes an end in itself rather than a means to flourishing. So settle in as we descend through the atmosphere of a world that saved itself from destruction, only to discover that salvation can be its own kind of prison. From nations to unity, the rise of the UN. To understand the Earth of the 24th century, we must first travel back to the 21st, to the period that shaped everything that came after. This was the era when Earth's nations finally confronted the consequences of centuries of industrial development, resource extraction, and environmental degradation. The world of the Expanse doesn't specify every detail of this period, but the broad strokes are painted clearly enough. Climate change reached catastrophic levels. The damage to Earth's ecosystem became existential, and the survival of civilization itself hung in the balance. Imagine the moment when the evidence became impossible to ignore. Not just rising temperatures or extreme weather events, though those played their part. We're talking about the point at which the polar ice caps began their final, irreversible collapse. The moment when it became clear that sea levels would rise not by inches, but by meters. When coastal cities from New York to Shanghai, from London to Mumbai, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, faced the prospect of drowning beneath advancing oceans. When agricultural regions that had fed billions for generations began to fail, their soil exhausted, their water supplies compromised, their weather patterns rendered unpredictable and hostile. The response to this crisis became the defining political transformation of the 21st century. Earth's nations, which had spent millennia competing for resources, fighting wars, and maintaining their sovereign independence, recognized that the environmental catastrophe transcended all borders. No single nation could solve problems that affected the entire planetary ecosystem. No economic bloc could address climate change alone. The damage was universal, and the response would need to be equally comprehensive. This realization didn't come easily or quickly. The novels and television series don't detail the political struggles that must have occurred, but we can infer the broad outline. There must have been resistance from nations unwilling to cede sovereignty, from populations suspicious of global government, from economic interests that saw their power threatened by international cooperation. There must have been false starts and partial measures, attempts at international coordination that failed because they didn't go far enough, or because participating nations prioritized their own interests over collective survival. But eventually, the crisis deepened to the point where resistance became futile. The environmental damage reached levels so severe that continuing on the old path meant civilizational collapse, perhaps even extinction. At this inflection point, something remarkable happened. Earth's nations, one by one, began formally ceding their governing authority to the United Nations. Not as a symbolic gesture or a diplomatic nicety, but as an actual transfer of sovereign power. National governments didn't disappear entirely, but they became subordinate to the United Nations, in the same way that state governments in a federation are subordinate to the national government. The UN transformed from an international organization facilitating cooperation into an actual planetary government with the authority to make and enforce decisions that affected all of humanity. This process of unification happened gradually over the course of the 21st century, but by its end, the transformation was complete. The United Nations had become the United Nations in the truest sense. a unified government for a world that had finally accepted it needed to function as a single political entity to survive. The Secretary General, once merely a diplomatic position, became the head of state and government for all of Earth and its lunar colonies. The Security Council evolved from a forum for great powers to the principal advisory body for the Secretary General on matters of security and foreign policy. The General Assembly became Earth's parliament, representing citizens rather than nations. The structure that emerged from this transformation combined elements of different governmental systems. At its core, the United Nations is a federal, parliamentary, representative, democratic republic. The Secretary General serves as both head of state and head of government, combining roles that many nations had kept separate. Beneath this executive office sits the Secretariat, the bureaucratic apparatus that actually implements policy and manages the day-to-day governance of 30 billion people. The General Assembly provides the legislative function, though the series makes clear that real power often flows through other channels, through the relationships between powerful individuals, through the manipulation of political networks that stretch back through generations of Earth's governing elite. The judicial branch exists in the form of the Court of Justice, though we see relatively little of it in either the novels or the television series. The military branches, the United Nations Navy and the United Nations Marine Corps, answer directly to the Secretary General as Commander-in-Chief, making the office holder arguably the most powerful individual in all of human-controlled space, at least on paper. But paper power and actual power often diverge, as the Expanse demonstrates repeatedly. The United Nations government that we see operating in the 24th century is a complex beast, a bureaucracy of staggering size, managing a world of overwhelming complexity. It's a government that successfully navigated humanity through its darkest environmental crisis, that established colonies throughout the solar system, that maintained its authority even as Mars fought for and won independence. Yet it's also a government that has ossified in certain ways, that has become reactive rather than proactive, that maintains its power as much through inertia and the absence of alternatives as through actual effectiveness. The environmental recovery programs that began in the 21st century continue 300 years later, a testament both to the severity of the damage and to the difficulty of healing a wounded planet. Sea levels, having risen by more than 20 meters, remain at those elevated levels. Coastal regions that were once the centers of human civilization now lie beneath the waves or behind massive seawalls. The ecosystem, while stabilized, remains compromised. Trees have become rare enough that characters from Earth treat woodlands with a kind of reverence that suggests they've become unusual rather than commonplace. 30% of Earth's total energy output goes toward recycling systems necessary to manage the waste of 30 billion people. A staggering allocation of resources just to maintain basic habitability. These ongoing environmental challenges shape everything about Earth's society and politics. The planet survived, yes, but it survived as a diminished thing, permanently marked by its brush with self-destruction. The scars serve as constant reminders that humanity once came within a hair's breadth of destroying its only natural habitat. and that only desperate measures and planetary coordination saved it from that fate. This history colors all of Earth's interactions with its colonies. To Earthers, the environmental recovery represents triumph over catastrophe, proof that humanity can solve any problem if it's willing to work together. To Mars and the Belt, it represents Earth's fundamental recklessness, the casual destruction of the only truly habitable planet in the solar system by a species that then turned around and demanded obedience from those it had forced to live in the harsh environments of space. The rise of the United Nations as a global government thus created the foundation for everything that follows in the Expanse's narrative. It established Earth as the dominant political and military power in human space. It created the administrative and technological apparatus necessary to maintain a population of 30 billion. It set the precedent that survival sometimes requires the surrender of old identities and old autonomies in favor of new, larger collective arrangements. And it ensured that when humanity finally began to spread beyond Earth, that expansion would be organized under UN authority, at least initially, with all the resentments and conflicts that implied for those who lived their lives in the cold and dark of space. The burden of Paradise Lost, climate and consequences. To truly grasp what Earth has become in the Expanse, you need to understand what it survived and what that survival cost. The planet we see in the series is not the Earth of nostalgic imagination, the blue marble of 20th century photographs that showed a world of clouds and oceans and green-brown continents. This Earth has been fundamentally altered by the climate catastrophe of the 21st century, and those alterations are not merely cosmetic. They represent a permanent transformation of humanity's relationship with its homeworld. Let's begin with the most visually striking change: the seawalls. When we see Earth in the Expanse, particularly in shots of New York City where the United Nations headquarters remains located, massive barriers rise from the water, holding back oceans that are now more than 20 meters higher than they were in our time. 20 meters. To put that in perspective, that's roughly a 7-story building's worth of sea level rise. Coastal cities that once sprawled along shorelines now huddle behind engineering marvels that would have been considered impossible in earlier eras. These seawalls are not simple barriers. They're sophisticated systems combining physical infrastructure with active management, constantly maintained and monitored, because failure would mean drowning the centers of human civilization. The series occasionally shows us glimpses of these structures, enough to convey their immense scale and the resources dedicated to their upkeep. They stand as monuments to both human ingenuity and human hubris, testaments to our species' ability to engineer solutions to problems of our own making, but also constant reminders that we created those problems in the first place. The New York that serves as the political capital of humanity is not the city of the early 21st century. The Manhattan we see in the show has been fundamentally reshaped by the rising seas. Districts that once fronted onto the water now sit behind walls. The geography of the city has been redrawn by necessity, and New York is merely one example. Similar transformations have occurred in every coastal city that survived the rise. Others, presumably, were simply abandoned, their populations relocated inland or to higher ground, becoming drowned ruins beneath the advanced waves. But the rising seas represent only the most visible aspect of Earth's environmental damage. The planet's ecosystem, while no longer actively collapsing by the time of the series, remains in a state of managed recovery that requires constant intervention and enormous resource allocation. 30% of Earth's total energy production goes toward recycling systems. This single statistic tells us volumes about the state of the planet. In a civilization with access to fusion power, providing effectively unlimited clean energy, a full third of that abundance must be dedicated simply to managing the waste streams of 30 billion people. Think about what that means in practical terms. This isn't energy going toward productive purposes, toward building new infrastructure or advancing technology or improving quality of life. This is energy spent on the civilizational equivalent of treading water, on preventing the massive human population from drowning in its own waste products. It's a staggering allocation of resources that suggests just how delicate the balance has become between Earth's carrying capacity and its actual population. The atmosphere itself bears the marks of past damage. While no longer actively deteriorating, it remains compromised in ways that the series hints at without fully detailing. The sky above Earth is no longer quite the same blue it once was. Air quality, while managed to survivable levels, is not what it once was. The simple act of breathing Earth's air, something that should be effortless and unremarkable, has become a privilege that Belters and Martians sometimes view with a mixture of longing and resentment. Trees, as mentioned earlier, have become rare. The series makes this clear through small details. Characters who grew up on Earth treating forests with a kind of reverence, the obvious scarcity of wood as a material, the fact that open land with trees growing on it has become something special rather than commonplace. This suggests massive deforestation, whether intentional or as a consequence of ecosystem collapse, followed by only partial reforestation efforts in the centuries since. The lungs of the planet have been damaged, and while humanity has found ways to compensate through technological means, the natural systems that once regulated Earth's atmosphere now exist only in diminished form. Agricultural land represents another area of permanent transformation. The series establishes that Earth's remaining open land outside its sprawling urban centers is dedicated almost entirely to automated industrial farming. These are not the pastoral agricultural landscapes of human history, with small farms worked by families passing land down through generations. These are vast mechanized operations where machines perform all the labor, producing food for billions through intensive, carefully managed processes. The efficiency is remarkable, sufficient to feed not only Earth's population, but much of the solar system as well. But the scale and intensity required to achieve this feat have eliminated any pretense of harmony between humanity and its food production systems. The climate itself, while stabilized, remains permanently altered from pre-industrial baselines. The series doesn't detail exactly how weather patterns have changed, but we can infer that they remain less predictable, more extreme, and generally more hostile than they were before humanity's industrial expansion. The fact that recovery efforts continue 300 years after the crisis began suggests that Earth's climate system was pushed so far out of equilibrium that it has settled into a new, different, stable state rather than returning to its original configuration. All of these environmental realities create a planet that, while habitable and even impressive in its way, represents a cautionary tale for humanity's expansion into space. The Martians, working to terraform their world over generations, look at Earth and see the consequences of carelessness. They're attempting to create a new habitable world through intentional, planned processes. And Earth's example shows them what happens when a habitable world is damaged through unplanned, reckless activity. The Belters, living in the artificial environments of stations and ships, view Earth as both a source of envy for its natural air and gravity, and a source of contempt for its failure to appreciate what it had, until nearly destroying it. This environmental legacy shapes Earth's politics in fundamental ways. The planet's leadership understands, whether consciously or not, that Earth's position as the center of human civilization rests partly on the fact that it remains the only naturally habitable world humanity possesses. Mars is working toward habitability, but won't achieve it for generations. The Belt offers only artificial environments. The colonies on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn exist in even harsher conditions. As long as this remains true, Earth retains a fundamental importance that transcends its political or military power. But the opening of the ring gates changes this calculus entirely. Suddenly, humanity has access to potentially thousands of habitable worlds. Planets that can support human life without requiring centuries of terraforming or constant technological intervention. Earth's monopoly on natural habitability evaporates overnight. The long-term consequences of this shift haven't fully played out by the end of the television series, but the implications are obvious. If billions of Earth's citizens can emigrate to worlds where they'll have space, opportunity, and natural environments, why would they remain on a crowded, ecologically damaged homeworld? The environmental burden Earth carries thus becomes not just a matter of managing the present, but of securing a viable future. The planet's leadership must navigate between maintaining the recovery programs that keep Earth habitable for 30 billion people and managing the political fallout of a population that increasingly sees emigration to colony worlds as preferable to remaining in the cradle of humanity. It's a delicate balance, and one that the series suggests Earth is struggling to maintain even before external crises intervene. The scars of climate catastrophe run deep, deeper than seawalls and recycling systems and managed forests. They run through the psyche of Earth's civilization, shaping how Earthers view themselves and their place in the solar system. They create a complex mixture of pride at having survived and shame at having nearly destroyed their world, of gratitude for stability and frustration at limitations, of determination to maintain their position and fear that their relevance is slipping away. This is the Earth that exists when the series begins, a wounded planet, stabilized but not healed, powerful but aware of its vulnerabilities, dominant but sensing that dominance slipping as the solar system's balance of power shifts and evolves. Understanding this environmental legacy is essential to understanding everything else about Earth in the Expanse, because it underlies all the social, political, and military realities that we'll explore in the sections ahead. Basic assistance, the Gilded Cage. Perhaps no aspect of Earth's society in the Expanse is more disturbing or more thought-provoking than the system known as basic assistance. On the surface, basic represents humanity's triumph over scarcity. It's a system that guarantees every citizen their survival needs: food, shelter, basic necessities. No one on Earth starves. No one dies of exposure. In a civilization that has solved the energy problem through fusion power and automated much of its production through advanced robotics and artificial intelligence, providing these necessities to even 30 billion people is technically feasible. But as the series repeatedly demonstrates, survival and flourishing are not the same thing. Basic assistance, as implemented on Earth, represents something far more complex and troubling than a simple universal welfare system. It's a mechanism of social control, a pressure valve for an economy that cannot provide productive work for all its citizens, and a psychological trap that condemns more than half of Earth's population to lives of comfortable desperation. Let's start with the numbers. More than 15 billion people, over half of Earth's population, live on basic assistance. These are people who do not have jobs, who cannot obtain jobs, who exist entirely on the support provided by the government. They live in government housing, eat food provided through government distribution systems, receive their necessities through automated services that ask nothing of them except that they continue existing. They are not citizens in the full sense, not participants in Earth's economy or productive members of society. They are simply maintained. The contrast with those who have employment could not be more stark. Having a job on Earth is not merely about income, though that matters. It's about status, about participation in society, about having a purpose beyond mere existence. The employed have access to better housing, better food, better medical care, better everything. More importantly, they have futures. They can save money, purchase property, improve their circumstances. They can have children without paying the heavy taxes imposed on basic recipients who choose to reproduce. They are, in a meaningful sense, full citizens in a way that those on basic are not. The system creates three distinct classes within Earth society. At the top are the employed, ranging from those working entry-level positions to the elite, who control vast wealth and political power. In the middle, in a strange liminal space, exist those on basic, guaranteed survival but denied participation. And at the bottom, invisible to the official systems, are the undocumented, people who exist entirely outside the government's recognition, receiving no assistance, unable to access employment, medical care, or education, surviving through whatever means they can find in the margins of society. The mechanism by which one escapes basic assistance reveals the system's true purpose: to apply for education beyond basic schooling, to access vocational training programs. To become eligible for employment, you need work credits, but to earn work credits, you need to work. The circularity is intentional. You cannot educate yourself out of basic without first demonstrating work discipline through actual employment. But you cannot obtain employment without education or training. The system is designed to keep most people on basic permanently, with only a few managing to break out through exceptional effort, connections, or sheer luck. The series provides us with a devastating example of this trap through a minor character encountered in the second season. A man living in the shadow of the UN building in New York, surviving on basic, describes putting himself on the vocational training list when he was 17 years old. He's now 52, still waiting for his slot. 35 years of waiting, of existing, of hoping for an opportunity that will likely never come. His children have grown up breathing radiation from the engine manufacturing facility near their community, exposed to hazards that would never be tolerated in wealthier areas, because people on basic have no power to demand better conditions. This is not theoretical poverty or abstract inequality. This is a system that has calcified into something approaching caste hierarchy, where the circumstances of your birth and the resources of your family determine your entire life trajectory, with very few exceptions. If you're born into a family with jobs, with connections, with the knowledge to navigate the bureaucracy, you have a path forward. If you're born on basic, in most cases, you'll die on basic. Your entire existence consisting of comfortable survival without meaning or purpose or hope of something better. The housing situation reflects this stratification. Those on basic live in government blocks, automated facilities that provide shelter efficiently but without dignity or privacy. The series shows us glimpses of these environments through characters like Amos Burton, whose childhood in Baltimore's slums reveals the dark underbelly of even this supposedly guaranteed survival. The areas where basic recipients live exist outside the protections enjoyed by employed citizens. Crime flourishes. Violence is common. Children are exploited in ways that suggest the government's nominal guarantees of survival don't always reach those most in need of protection. Meanwhile, the employed inhabit a completely different world, from comfortable middle-class suburbs to the exclusive enclaves of the ultra-wealthy. Those with jobs live in environments that bear little resemblance to the basic blocks. Private security ensures the wealthy never need to interact with the masses. quality of life improvements available to those with currency remain forever out of reach for those whose only income comes from government assistance. The gap between these worlds might as well be the gap between planets. The psychological impact of this system receives less attention in the series than perhaps it deserves, but we can infer its effects from the characters we meet. People on Basic exist in a state of enforced purposelessness. They have their survival needs met, but no way to contribute, no path to improvement, no sense that their existence matters to anyone, including themselves. They fill their days with whatever distractions are available, wandering crowded streets, consuming media, waiting for nothing in particular, because there's nothing to wait for. This is worse in many ways than simple poverty. Poverty at least allows for the possibility of improvement through effort. It offers the cold comfort of knowing that your circumstances result from material scarcity rather than deliberate exclusion. Basic assistance, by contrast, exists in a world of material abundance, where scarcity has been solved technologically but reimposed socially. The resources exist to provide everyone meaningful work, quality education, and paths to fulfilling lives. The system chooses not to distribute those opportunities, because doing so would require fundamental reorganization of how Earth's economy and society function. The justification offered for this system, when justification is offered at all, centers on work discipline and merit. The argument goes that if everyone could access education and employment without demonstrating commitment and ability through prior work, the system would be overwhelmed by people who lack the drive to contribute meaningfully. The requirement for work credits before accessing further education ensures that only those truly committed to improving themselves gain access to limited resources. This argument collapses under scrutiny. The limitation on educational resources is artificial, a choice rather than a necessity. In a civilization with effectively unlimited energy and advanced automation, providing quality education to all 30 billion people would be challenging, but not impossible. The work credit requirement serves not to protect scarce resources, but to maintain social hierarchy, to ensure that most people remain on basic, while a minority joins the employed class. It's rationing not of actual scarcity, but of opportunity itself. The series also hints at, without fully exploring, the question of what happens to those who refuse basic assistance or who fall through its cracks. The undocumented exist entirely outside the system, receiving no support, unable to access government services, often the children of basic recipients who couldn't afford the taxes on having children, but had them anyway. These people might number in the hundreds of millions or even billions. They survive through crime, through informal economies, through charity when charity is available. Their existence suggests that basic assistance, for all its problems, at least prevents the absolute destitution that would otherwise afflict Earth's surplus population. Characters who come from Earth often carry the psychological scars of this system. Amos Burton, one of the series' central characters, grew up in Baltimore's version of this environment. His childhood involved exploitation, violence, and the complete absence of authority figures interested in protecting children. The person he eventually became, functional but fundamentally damaged in his ability to form emotional connections, reflects the cost of raising humans in environments where survival is guaranteed, but care and genuine human connection are not. The contrast with Mars becomes particularly stark when considering basic assistance. Martian society, while far from perfect, maintains full employment through the comprehensive focus on terraforming. Every Martian contributes to the multi-generational project of making their world habitable. This shared purpose creates social cohesion and individual meaning that Earth's system cannot replicate. Martians work because their work matters, because they're building something larger than themselves, because they can see the results of their efforts in the slow transformation of their world. Earth has no equivalent unifying project. The environmental recovery programs continue, but their maintenance work, keeping the planet from further degradation rather than transforming it into something better. They don't inspire the way Mars's terraforming does. They don't provide enough employment to matter to the billions on Basic. They're necessary, but not sufficient to give Earth's population purpose. The opening of the ring gates promises to exacerbate Earth's basic assistance problem dramatically. Suddenly, thousands of habitable worlds become accessible. Colony ships begin departing, carrying those who can afford passage to new worlds where land is abundant, opportunity is real, and the chance to build something new outweighs the comfort of guaranteed survival. For those on Basic, emigration represents the only real path to a better life. But emigration costs money, requires skills, demands resources that Basic recipients don't have. The system that trapped them on Earth also prevents them from leaving. This creates a pressure cooker situation that the series explores in its later seasons. Earth's leadership faces the prospect of losing the employed, skilled portion of its population to emigration, while retaining the billions on Basic who lack the means to leave. This would make Earth's economic and social problems even more severe, reducing the productive population while maintaining or increasing the dependent population. The long-term sustainability of this arrangement seems questionable at best. Basic assistance, then, stands as perhaps the clearest example of how the Expanse presents social problems without offering easy answers. The system prevents mass starvation and homelessness, genuine achievements in a world of 30 billion people. But it does so at the cost of condemning more than half that population to lives devoid of meaning, purpose, or hope for improvement. It's a dystopia wrapped in the appearance of utopia, a gilded cage that offers survival but demands the surrender of any ambition beyond mere continued existence. The United Nations Navy, power projection through numbers. If basic assistance represents the domestic reality of Earth's societal challenges, the United Nations Navy represents the external face of Earth's power. This is where we see humanity's homeworld at its most impressive, commanding the largest military force in human history, projecting power across billions of kilometers of space, maintaining order, and protecting interests throughout the solar system. The UNN is Earth's iron fist, the military might that ensures the United Nations remains the dominant superpower despite the challenges and weaknesses we've discussed. Let's begin with the sheer scale. The United Nations Navy operates hundreds of warships, from massive dreadnoughts bristling with railguns and missile batteries to sleek destroyers and corvettes designed for rapid response and patrol duties. The exact composition of the fleet shifts throughout the series as ships are built, lost, or reassigned, but the fundamental reality remains constant. The UNN outnumbers every other naval force in the solar system by a significant margin. When Mars fields one dreadnought, Earth can field 3 or 4. When the Outer Planets Alliance cobbles together a ragtag fleet of converted civilian vessels, Earth can respond with purpose-built warships crewed by professional sailors. This numerical superiority stems directly from Earth's massive population and industrial capacity. With 30 billion people, the UN can afford to dedicate millions to military service without significantly impacting civilian economic functions. The shipyards orbiting Earth and scattered across Luna work continuously, producing vessels that range from small patrol craft to enormous capital ships capable of engaging multiple enemies simultaneously. The raw resources required for this construction come from the Belt and Outer System, but the organization, expertise, and workforce come from Earth and Mars, with Earth's larger population giving it an inherent advantage in scaling production. The flagship of the UNN, at least at the series' beginning, is the UNN Agamemnon, a Truman-class dreadnought that serves as the mobile command center for Earth's naval operations. These dreadnoughts are the capital ships around which Earth's battle groups form, vessels measuring hundreds of meters in length, armed with multiple railgun batteries, torpedo tubes, and point defense cannons. They're designed to serve as command and control platforms to provide overwhelming firepower in fleet engagements and to project Earth's military power across the vast distances of the solar system. Beneath the dreadnoughts in the naval hierarchy sit various classes of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. The Leonidas-class destroyer appears frequently in the series, a versatile platform capable of independent operations or fleet service. These ships form the backbone of the UNN, handling everything from convoy escort to patrol duties to anti-piracy operations in the Belt. They're not as heavily armed as the dreadnoughts, but they're faster, more maneuverable, and can be deployed more flexibly. The series also introduces us to various specialized vessels within the UNN fleet. Troop transports carry the United Nations Marine Corps on deployment. Supply ships maintain the logistics chains that keep the fleet operational across vast distances. Communication ships relay orders and intelligence throughout the UN's area of operations. The complexity of maintaining such a diverse fleet across the solar system represents a staggering administrative and logistical challenge. but it's one that Earth's government has been meeting for generations. However, numerical superiority alone doesn't guarantee tactical or strategic success, and this is where the UNN's limitations become apparent. Mars, though fielding a smaller fleet, has focused its civilization's resources on achieving technological superiority. Martian ships are faster, their weapons more accurate, their armor more effective, their electronic warfare capabilities more sophisticated. The Martian Congressional Republic Navy operates on the principle of quality over quantity, building fewer ships but ensuring each one represents the cutting edge of human military technology. This technological gap creates a complex strategic situation. In a hypothetical war between Earth and Mars, the outcome would depend on numerous factors beyond simple ship counts. Martian vessels could engage UN ships at longer ranges, strike with greater precision, and maneuver more effectively. But Earth's numerical advantage means that even if Martian ships achieve favorable exchange rates, destroying 2 or 3 UN vessels for every Martian ship lost, Earth's larger fleet could potentially absorb those losses, while Mars could not. It's a calculation that both sides understand, contributing to the tense but stable peace that exists between humanity's two great powers throughout most of the series. The UNN's personnel represent another significant advantage. Unlike Mars, which recruits primarily from its relatively small population of colonists, or the OPA, which relies heavily on volunteers with limited formal training, Earth can draw upon billions of potential recruits. This allows the UN to maintain professional military academies, to implement rigorous selection processes, and to ensure that most positions on UN warships are filled by trained, experienced personnel. The naval officers we encounter throughout the series, regardless of their moral qualities or decision-making abilities, consistently demonstrate competence in their technical duties. They know their ships, understand naval tactics, and can execute complex maneuvers under pressure. Moreover, Earth's personnel benefit from being born and raised in full gravity. This might seem like a minor detail, but it has significant implications for military operations. When UN Marines board a hostile ship or conduct operations on planetary surfaces with meaningful gravity, they're operating in conditions similar to those they experienced throughout their lives. Belters, by contrast, struggle in anything above minimal gravity, their bodies adapted to the low-G or zero-G environments of stations and ships. Martians fall somewhere in between, comfortable in Mars's 1/3 Earth gravity, but potentially at a disadvantage in Earth normal conditions. This physiological advantage extends the UNN's power projection capabilities, making Earth's military effective not just in space, but on any solid body with significant gravity. The United Nations Marine Corps deserves special attention as a component of Earth's military might. With more than 100 million active personnel, the UNMC represents the largest standing army in human history. These forces are distributed across the solar system, with major deployments on Ganymede, various belt stations, and throughout Earth's territory. They serve as occupation forces, peacekeepers, security personnel, and, when necessary, assault troops, capable of seizing and holding territory in the harshest environments imaginable. The Marines we encounter in the series, particularly Roberta Bobby Draper before her defection to Mars's side, demonstrate the capability and professionalism of these forces. They're equipped with advanced powered armor that enhances strength, provides protection, and incorporates sophisticated sensor and weapon systems. They train constantly for combat in zero-G, in vacuum, on planetary surfaces, and in urban environments. They represent the sharp end of Earth's military power, the forces that actually close with and engage enemies in the brutal close-quarters combat that space warfare sometimes demands. The strategic deployment of the UNN reflects Earth's priorities and concerns. Major fleet elements are stationed near Earth itself, protecting the homeworld and serving as a strategic reserve. Additional forces patrol the asteroid belt, ostensibly protecting shipping and mining operations, but also projecting power into what has become increasingly contested space as belt independence movements gain strength. Ganymede, with its agricultural domes feeding much of the outer system, receives significant military protection, and picket forces are scattered throughout the inner and middle system, ready to respond to threats or investigate anomalies. This distribution reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of Earth's strategic position. The UN can maintain a presence nearly everywhere in the solar system, but spreading forces so widely means that local superiority is never guaranteed. Mars, by concentrating its smaller fleet more effectively, can sometimes achieve tactical advantages in specific locations, despite Earth's overall numerical dominance. The OPA, operating more like guerrilla forces or pirates than a conventional military, can strike at vulnerable targets and disappear before UN forces can respond in strength. The series demonstrates this dynamic repeatedly through space combat sequences that showcase both the UNN's capabilities and its vulnerabilities. When UN ships engage enemies at close range in situations where numbers matter, they tend to prevail. But when Martian forces dictate the terms of engagement, fighting at long range where their technological advantages dominate, UN ships suffer. And when OPA forces employ asymmetric tactics, using civilian ships as cover or launching surprise attacks from unexpected vectors, the UN's conventional military strength proves less decisive than its commanders would prefer. The opening of the ring gates creates new challenges for the UNN that the series is just beginning to explore as it concludes. Suddenly, the area that Earth's military must protect expands dramatically. Instead of just the solar system with its known geography and established patrol routes, the UN must now consider defending interests across potentially thousands of star systems. The fleet that seemed overwhelming when concentrated in one system becomes inadequate when distributed across many. This strategic dilution threatens to undermine one of Earth's core advantages: forcing the UN to either massively expand its military at great cost or accept reduced ability to project power into the new frontiers. Technologically, the UNN operates at a level that would seem almost magical to 21st century observers, but is simply standard for the 24th century. Their ships are powered by fusion reactors using the Epstein drive, a revolutionary propulsion system that allows constant acceleration and makes crossing the solar system in weeks rather than years routine. Their weapons include railguns that fire projectiles at significant fractions of light speed, torpedoes with sophisticated guidance systems and nuclear warheads, and point defense cannons that can intercept incoming fire. Their sensors can detect ships across millions of kilometers, and their communication systems allow near real-time coordination across the solar system, despite light speed delays. Yet for all this impressive technology, the UNN faces the same fundamental limitations as all military forces in the Expanse's universe. Space is vast. Combat ranges are enormous, and detection is relatively easy compared to hiding. This creates a strategic environment where battles often become wars of attrition, where victory goes to whoever can maintain fire superiority longest, where tactical brilliance matters less than logistical depth and industrial capacity. In this environment, Earth's advantages are substantial but not decisive, powerful but not overwhelming. The series also explores the human dimension of Earth's military power through characters who serve or have served in the UNN. Captain Souther, who commands a UN dreadnought during the Eros crisis, embodies the professionalism and moral complexity of Earth's naval officers. He follows orders, maintains discipline, and operates his ship with competence. But he also questions directives that seem wrong and ultimately makes the choice to disobey when he believes the civilian leadership has made catastrophically poor decisions. His fate, death at the hands of subordinates who remain loyal to those civilian leaders, illustrates the tensions within Earth's military between institutional loyalty and personal conscience. Admiral Nguyen, by contrast, represents the darker possibilities inherent in Earth's military establishment, willing to sacrifice millions of lives on Eros to prevent the proto-molecule from reaching Earth. He demonstrates how Earth's military power can be directed by individuals whose calculations prioritize abstract strategic goals over human lives. His actions, though ultimately thwarted, reveal how Earth's vast military machine can become an instrument of atrocity when guided by the wrong hands. The relationship between Earth's civilian government and its military forces forms a constant undercurrent in the series. In theory, the military answers to the Secretary General, and through that office to the UN civilian institutions. In practice, military leaders possess significant autonomy, particularly when operating far from Earth, where communication delays make real-time civilian oversight impossible. This creates opportunities for military personnel to interpret orders broadly, to make decisions that commit Earth to courses of action, and occasionally to pursue agendas that diverge from civilian preferences. The UNN's financial and resource requirements represent another aspect of its role in Earth's society, maintaining hundreds of warships, supporting over 100 million Marines, operating shipyards and training facilities, and conducting operations across the solar system requires enormous expenditure. These resources come from Earth's economy, ultimately funded by taxes on the employed population and the wealth generated by Earth's remaining industries and its control of interplanetary trade. The opportunity cost is significant. Resources devoted to the military cannot be used for domestic programs, infrastructure improvement, or the basic assistance system that barely sustains half of Earth's population. Yet, Earth's leadership consistently prioritizes military spending because they understand that military power remains the foundation of Earth's position in the solar system. Without the UNN, Earth would be unable to protect its interests in the belt, unable to compete with Mars for influence and territory, unable to maintain the flow of resources from the outer system that keeps 30 billion people fed. The military spending is not optional, not a discretionary choice that could be reduced without consequences. It's the price Earth pays to remain relevant in a solar system where power comes from the barrel of a railgun and influence flows from the deployment of fleets. As the series progresses and external threats emerge, the UNN's role evolves. The proto-molecule crisis forces Earth's military to confront enemies that don't follow conventional rules of engagement. The Free Navy War demonstrates the vulnerability of Earth's dominance to asymmetric attacks, and the opening of the Ring Gates reveals opportunities and challenges that neither the UN's strategic planners nor its tactical commanders were prepared to handle. Through it all, the UNN remains Earth's primary tool for exerting influence beyond its atmosphere, the military might that keeps the homeworld of humanity powerful and feared throughout human-controlled space. The United Nations Navy represents Earth's military might, then Christian Avasarala represents its political acumen, its willingness to do whatever proves necessary to maintain power, and its deep-seated fear that, despite all its advantages, Earth's dominance might be slipping away. Avasarala is perhaps the most fully realized character from Earth in the entire series, a woman who embodies both the best and worst of her homeworld's political culture. Understanding her means understanding the mindset of Earth's ruling elite and the desperate calculations that guide their decisions. Let's start with the most striking aspect of Avasarala's character. She is one of the most powerful individuals in the entire solar system, effectively running Earth's foreign policy and often domestic policy as well. Yet she has never stood for election. She holds the position of Deputy Under-Secretary of the United Nations, a title that sounds bureaucratic and middle tier, but which, in the reality of UN governance, places her at the center of power. This reflects a crucial truth about Earth's government. Real power doesn't always come from official titles or democratic mandates. It comes from relationships, from understanding how the machinery of government actually works, from knowing whose support matters and how to secure it. Avasarala didn't accumulate this power through charisma or popular support. She gained it through competence, through decades of navigating the Byzantine complexity of UN politics, through cultivating relationships with other powerful individuals, and through demonstrating again and again that she could be trusted to protect Earth's interests, regardless of the personal cost. By the time we meet her in the series, she's already an institution, someone who has outlasted multiple secretary generals, survived countless political crises, and established herself as indispensable to Earth's leadership. Her methods are ruthless. Avasarala manipulates, deceives, threatens, and when necessary, orders actions that result in deaths. She authorizes enhanced interrogation of suspects. She withholds information from allies when doing so serves Earth's interests. She makes deals with unsavory individuals and organizations if those deals benefit the UN. She treats morality as something to be managed rather than something that should constrain her actions. In a less nuanced work of fiction, she would be a straightforward villain. But The Expanse gives us the context that makes her comprehensible, if not entirely sympathetic. That context begins with personal tragedy. Avasarala's grandson, we learn, was killed years before the series begins, a victim of the complex power struggles that define solar system politics. This loss haunts her, shapes her worldview, and informs her conviction that strength represents the only reliable deterrent to violence. She believes that if Earth shows weakness, if it fails to maintain its dominant position, the result will be not peace, but war, not cooperation, but exploitation. Her ruthlessness stems not from sadism or hunger for power, but from the belief that the alternative to Earth's dominance would be far worse. She also carries the weight of Earth's environmental near catastrophe. Though she's too young to have lived through the worst of the climate crisis, she grew up in its aftermath, in a world still bearing the scars of humanity's brush with self-destruction. This history influences her understanding of what's at stake. She knows that human civilization is fragile, that it has nearly destroyed itself once, and that preventing a repeat requires constant vigilance and often ugly choices. She sees herself as one of the people making those ugly choices so that billions of others don't have to. Her relationship with other characters in the series reveals different facets of her personality, with Bobby Draper, the Martian Marine who becomes her unlikely protege and friend. Avasarala shows surprising warmth and genuine affection. She recognizes in Bobby someone similar to herself, a woman who loves her homeworld, who has sacrificed much in its service, but who also possesses a moral core that won't compromise on fundamental principles. Their relationship becomes one of mutual respect and genuine friendship, despite the political gulf between their nations. With James Holden, the idealistic captain of the Rocinante, Avasarala's interaction is more complicated. She recognizes his fundamental decency and his unusual commitment to transparency and honesty in a universe that rewards neither quality. But she also finds his idealism frustrating, his unwillingness to make hard compromises dangerous, and his tendency to broadcast information without considering the consequences infuriating. Yet she comes to rely on him precisely because his moral compass points true, because he can see options and possibilities that her more cynical perspective misses. Her rise to Secretary General, which occurs during the later seasons of the television series, represents both a triumph and a burden. The position gives her the formal authority to match the informal power she's wielded for years, but it also makes her directly responsible for Earth's fate in ways that her previous role didn't require. As Deputy Undersecretary, she could advocate for positions, implement policy, and influence decisions while maintaining some distance from ultimate accountability. As Secretary General, every success and failure lands directly on her shoulders. The series' portrayal of Avasarala is remarkable for refusing to soften her edges or apologize for her methods, while also showing us the human being beneath the political operator. She's shown it home with her husband, displaying tenderness and vulnerability that her public persona never reveals. She's shown grieving her losses, questioning her decisions, and struggling with the weight of responsibility. She's allowed to be fully human, complex and contradictory, ruthless in pursuit of her goals, yet haunted by the costs of achieving them. Her dialogue is legendary among fans of the series, both for its eloquence and for its profanity. Avasarala swears constantly and creatively, using vulgarity as both a weapon and a defense mechanism. This linguistic choice serves multiple purposes. It establishes her as someone who refuses to be constrained by conventional propriety. It keeps people off balance, making them underestimate her or react emotionally rather than strategically. And it's simply authentic to who she is, a woman from Earth's subcontinent, operating in spaces traditionally dominated by others, who has never felt the need to soften herself to succeed. Her political philosophy, insofar as it can be extracted from her actions and statements, centers on maintaining stability through strength. She believes that clear hierarchies and recognized power structures, while unjust in many ways, prevent the chaos and violence that would emerge from their absence. Earth's dominance isn't fair to Mars or the Belt, but challenging that dominance would lead to war that would kill millions. Therefore, Earth must maintain its position, must be willing to use force to deter challenges, must demonstrate that the costs of opposition exceed any potential benefits. This philosophy faces its ultimate test when Marco Inaros and the Free Navy launch their devastating attack on Earth. Avasarala had intelligence suggesting something major was being planned, but she underestimated the scale and audacity of the attack. The failure haunts her. She had the power to potentially prevent the catastrophe, and she failed to see what was coming until too late. The billions who died in the bombardment died, in part, because she and Earth's intelligence apparatus missed the signs or misinterpreted their significance. Her response to this failure is characteristic. She doesn't resign, doesn't collapse under the guilt, doesn't allow despair to incapacitate her. Instead, she marshals Earth's remaining resources, coordinates the response to the crisis, works to maintain social order as her world descends into chaos, and begins planning how to ensure nothing like this can happen again. The iron will that served her throughout her career becomes the foundation upon which Earth's survival and eventual recovery will rest. The series also uses Avasarala to explore questions about the relationship between democracy and effective governance. She's never been elected to anything, yet she wields more power than many democratically chosen leaders. Is this a failure of Earth's democratic institutions, or a recognition that governing complex civilizations sometimes requires expertise and relationships that electoral politics don't necessarily select for? The series doesn't answer definitively, but it presents the question through Avasarala's character and career. Similarly, her willingness to make morally questionable decisions to achieve strategic objectives raises uncomfortable questions about leadership in dangerous times. When is ruthlessness justified? When does pragmatism cross into simple cruelty? How do we judge leaders who achieve good outcomes through bad methods versus those who maintain moral purity but fail to protect their people? Avasarala embodies these dilemmas, forcing viewers to grapple with the gap between the leaders we might wish we had and the leaders who might actually be effective in crises. Her relationships with her family, particularly her husband, provide crucial humanizing context. Here is someone who has ordered deaths, who has manipulated governments, who has lied and schemed and done things that would horrify most people. Yet she returns home to a man who knows her fully, who loves her despite understanding what she's capable of, who provides the emotional support that allows her to continue functioning under impossible pressure. This relationship suggests that even the most hardened political operators need spaces where they can be vulnerable, where they can acknowledge their doubts and fears, where they can maintain connection to the better parts of their humanity. As Earth's situation deteriorates through the series, Avasarala's character arc becomes increasingly tragic. She dedicated her life to preventing exactly the kind of catastrophe that ultimately befalls her world. She made hard choices, sacrificed relationships, did things she's ashamed of, all in service of keeping Earth safe and strong. And despite all her efforts, despite all her competence and cunning and willingness to do whatever proved necessary, she failed to prevent billions of deaths and the crippling of human civilization's homeworld. Yet even in failure, even with her world literally burning, Avasarala doesn't break. She adapts. She continues fighting. She refuses to allow despair or guilt to paralyze her when her people need leadership. This resilience, this absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances, represents perhaps her most admirable quality. Whatever else can be said about her methods or her philosophy, Christian Avasarala never stops fighting for Earth and for humanity's survival. She stands as one of the Expanse's most compelling explorations of political power, of the costs of leadership, and of the complex moral terrain that leaders must navigate in a universe that doesn't care about their good intentions. Understanding her means understanding Earth itself. Powerful but afraid, proud but scarred, dominant but knowing that dominance is temporary, willing to do terrible things to maintain its position, while haunted by the knowledge that none of it might be enough. The bombardment, when the sky fell. If there's a single event that defines Earth's trajectory in the Expanse, it's the asteroid bombardment orchestrated by Marco Inaros and his Free Navy. This attack represents the deadliest single military action in human history, killing billions in a matter of hours and fundamentally altering the balance of power in the solar system. To understand the significance of this catastrophe, we need to examine how it happened, what it accomplished, and what it reveals about the vulnerabilities inherent even in seemingly invincible superpowers. The architect of this devastation was Marco Inaros, a Belter revolutionary whose charisma and tactical brilliance made him one of the most dangerous individuals in the solar system. Marco wasn't merely a terrorist or a simple revolutionary. He was a visionary, in the most terrible sense of that word. Someone who saw clearly what was required to break Earth's dominance, and who possessed the will to act on that vision, regardless of the moral cost. His plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Use stealth technology to render asteroids invisible to Earth's defenses, then drop them on the home world of humanity like hammer blows from an angry god. The preparation for this attack took years and required resources that the Belt had never previously been able to marshal. Marco built coalitions among various Belt factions, securing both political support and material resources. He obtained stealth coding technology, likely from sources within Mars's military-industrial complex, who were willing to betray their own civilization for profit or ideology. He selected asteroids based on size, composition, and orbital mechanics, choosing targets that could be redirected toward Earth with achievable expenditure of fuel, and which would survive the journey through space and Earth's atmosphere to deliver maximum devastation. The stealth coding was crucial. Earth's defense network was extensive, designed to detect and intercept any natural asteroid on a collision course with the planet. But stealth technology, originally developed for military vessels, could render objects effectively invisible to most sensors. By coating asteroids in this material and managing their thermal signatures carefully, Marco's forces created weapons that Earth's sensors couldn't detect until far too late. The homeworld's defenses, impressive as they were, had been designed to counter different threats. No one had seriously contemplated the possibility of weaponized asteroids rendered invisible through military technology. The attack, when it came, was coordinated to maximize both physical and psychological impact. Multiple asteroids were launched simultaneously from different vectors, ensuring that even if some were detected and intercepted, others would reach their targets. The Free Navy timed the attack to coincide with other operations that would prevent Earth from mounting an effective response, particularly the destruction or capture of UN naval assets that might have been repositioned to provide defensive fire. The first impact struck North Africa. The asteroid, traveling at orbital velocities that translated to kinetic energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons, punched through Earth's atmosphere in seconds. The impact released energy on a scale that beggars description. The fireball, visible from space, the shock wave racing outward at supersonic speeds. The material ejected from the impact site launched into the atmosphere, some of it achieving escape velocity, most of it falling back across a wide area. Within minutes, millions were dead. Within hours, as secondary effects propagated, that number climbed toward billions. The second impact followed shortly after, striking somewhere in North America. Again, the immediate devastation was total in a radius of hundreds of kilometers around the impact site. Cities evaporated. Terrain was reshaped by the force of the collision, and the material thrown into the atmosphere began the process that would threaten Earth's entire ecosystem. The creation of a debris cloud that would block sunlight, crash temperatures, and threaten the agricultural systems that fed 30 billion people. The third successful impact hit South Asia, completing a triplet of catastrophes that no nation in history had ever survived. Each impact was individually capable of ending civilizations. Together, they represented an extinction-level event, not quite capable of exterminating humanity entirely, but certainly sufficient to kill billions and send Earth spiraling into a new dark age. The death toll from the initial impacts exceeded 2 billion within the first day. Secretary General Nancy Gao was among the dead, killed when the impact in North Africa sent a tsunami racing across the Mediterranean that breached New York seawalls and flooded large portions of the city. The loss of the Secretary General at such a critical moment created a political crisis on top of the physical catastrophe, leaving Earth's government scrambling to establish a clear chain of command while simultaneously managing an unprecedented disaster. The tsunami that killed Gao illustrated another dimension of the catastrophe. Earth's coastal cities, protected behind their massive seawalls, had felt relatively secure against the elevated sea levels, but those walls were not designed to withstand tsunami waves generated by asteroid impacts thousands of kilometers away. The walls failed. The cities flooded. Millions who had survived the initial impacts drowned in the following hours. Infrastructure built up over centuries was destroyed in minutes. the centers of human civilization, the seats of government and commerce and culture, were devastated. Earth's defense network finally activated as it detected incoming asteroids, but by then it was too late to prevent the major impacts. The railgun platforms and missile batteries that surrounded Earth did manage to intercept some of the smaller asteroids in the attack, preventing what could have been an even worse catastrophe. But the primary targets, the three largest asteroids that Marco had counted on reaching the surface, had already struck. The defenses that should have protected Earth had failed not because they were inadequate in themselves, but because they'd been blind until the last moments. The bombardment didn't end with those three successful impacts. Marco's Free Navy continued launching asteroids at Earth for months afterward, though none of the later attacks achieved the same devastating success. Earth's military, recovering from its shock and reorganizing its defensive assets, managed to intercept most subsequent attempts, but the continuing attacks forced Earth to dedicate enormous resources to defense, resources that couldn't be used for rescue operations, infrastructure repair, or feeding refugees. The bombardment strategy evolved into a siege, pinning Earth down and preventing recovery, while the Free Navy consolidated control over belt resources. The physical damage to Earth was catastrophic enough, but the secondary effects proved even more devastating in the long term. The debris thrown into the atmosphere by the impacts began spreading globally, creating a layer of particulate matter that blocked sunlight. Temperatures started dropping as solar radiation that should have been warming the surface instead was reflected back into space or absorbed by the debris cloud. This induced a form of impact winter, similar to the nuclear winter that Earth's military planners had contemplated during the Cold War but had never actually experienced. The agricultural implications of this cooling were immediate and severe. Earth's food production depended on carefully managed automated farming systems that required specific temperature ranges and sunlight levels to function properly. As temperatures dropped and sunlight decreased, crop yields plummeted. Fields that should have been producing food for billions instead yielded nothing. Within weeks, Earth faced the prospect of famine on a scale unprecedented in human history. The planet that had fed much of the solar system now couldn't feed itself. The radioactive contamination from the impacts added another layer of crisis. The asteroids, traveling at such extreme velocities, had created conditions at impact that rendered much of the strike zones radioactive. Fallout began spreading from the impact sites, contaminating water supplies, agricultural land, and simply the air that people breathed. Areas hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the actual impacts became uninhabitable due to radiation levels. Millions more died from radiation sickness in the weeks and months following the bombardment, their bodies unable to withstand the invisible poisons saturating their environment. The social and political breakdown that followed the bombardment illustrated just how thin the veneer of civilization becomes when survival itself is threatened. In areas far from the impacts, where physical damage was minimal but supply chains had collapsed, riots broke out as people fought over dwindling resources. The basic assistance system, already inadequate, completely failed as distribution networks were destroyed or overwhelmed. Those living in the impact zones who had survived the initial strikes began attempting to flee. creating refugee streams of hundreds of millions of people with nowhere to go. The employed and the wealthy used their resources to secure access to whatever food, water, and shelter remained available, while those on basic were left to fend for themselves, with predictably catastrophic results. Earth's military, the mighty United Nations Navy that had dominated the solar system, found itself largely impotent in the face of this catastrophe. Warships capable of destroying fleets couldn't feed hungry civilians or repair shattered infrastructure. The Marines, trained for combat in the harshest environments, found themselves redirected to disaster relief and refugee management, roles they'd never trained for and which their organization wasn't designed to fulfill effectively. The realization that military power, for all its importance, couldn't address the consequences of the attack created a crisis of confidence within Earth's security establishment. The bombardment also revealed the extent to which Earth had become dependent on the belt for survival. Much of Earth's food came from Ganymede's agricultural domes. Many critical resources were mined in the belt and shipped to Earth for processing or direct use. The supply chains that sustained 30 billion people stretched across hundreds of millions of kilometers, and Marco's control of belt infrastructure meant he could cut those supply lines at will. Earth was under siege not just from falling asteroids, but from resource starvation. Unable to access the materials it needed to rebuild or even to maintain basic survival for its enormous population. The psychological impact on Earth's population matched the physical devastation. For centuries, Earth had been the dominant power in human space, the center of civilization, the world that all other settlements depended on. That position had created a sense of security, even invulnerability. The bombardment shattered that illusion completely. Earth wasn't invincible. It could be hurt, badly, by opponents who had previously been dismissed as mere terrorists or rebels. The confidence that had characterized Earth's attitude toward its colonies evaporated, replaced by fear and uncertainty about whether their world could recover, or whether they'd witness the beginning of their civilization's end. The attack also created complex political dynamics among the three major powers. Mars, while not directly responsible for the bombardment, had supplied the stealth technology that made it possible. This created an enormous diplomatic crisis between Earth and Mars, with many on Earth viewing Mars as complicit in genocide. The belt was divided between those who celebrated Marco's blow against Earth and those horrified by the mass death. And within Earth itself, calls for retaliation competed with the desperate need to focus on survival and recovery. The bombing had rewritten the political landscape of the solar system, creating alliances and enmities that would shape events for years to come. Christian Avasarala, having survived the tsunami that killed Secretary General Gao, found herself thrust into leadership during Earth's darkest hour. Her response to the crisis demonstrated both her strengths and the limitations any leader faces when catastrophe strikes. She coordinated what relief efforts could be mounted. She worked to maintain governmental continuity. She began planning for long-term recovery. But she also had to make impossible choices about resource allocation, about which regions would receive aid and which would be abandoned, about how to maintain order when the systems that had sustained order for centuries had collapsed. The bombardment of Earth stands as one of the most devastating events in science fiction, a catastrophe that feels grounded and plausible despite its immense scale. It demonstrates how vulnerable even the mightiest civilization becomes when unexpected tactics bypass its defenses. It shows the fragility of complex systems that depend on long supply chains and delicate balances, and it forces both the characters and the audience to confront questions about justice, revenge, survival, and what humanity might become in the aftermath of nearly destroying itself for a second time in its history. Earth after the fall, nuclear winter and starvation. The immediate horror of the bombardment was devastating enough, but the months and years that followed revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. Earth, the planet that had survived environmental collapse 2 centuries earlier, now faced an even more severe crisis. The asteroid impacts had created conditions that threatened not just governments or civilizations, but the basic survival of the 30 billion humans still living on the scarred homeworld of humanity. The impact winter that developed in the weeks following the bombardment represented the most immediate threat to Earth's population. The debris cloud in the atmosphere, composed of vaporized asteroid material, pulverized rock from the impact sites, and vast quantities of dust and particulates, spread globally with shocking speed. Within a month, the cloud had encircled the planet, creating a barrier between Earth's surface and the sun that should have been providing light and warmth. Global temperatures began dropping rapidly. The climate models that Earth's scientists had been using for centuries to manage the planet's environmental recovery suddenly had to account for a new variable: artificial cooling on a massive scale. The projections were uniformly grim. Temperatures would continue falling for months, potentially years. The growing seasons for most crops would become impossibly short. Areas that had been temperate would experience winter conditions year-round. The carefully balanced ecosystem that humanity had spent centuries stabilizing was being shocked into a new configuration, and no one could predict with certainty what that new equilibrium would look like, or whether it would be compatible with human survival. The agricultural collapse that resulted from the impact winter represented Earth's most critical crisis. The planet's food production systems, automated facilities covering vast areas of land, were designed to operate within specific environmental parameters. When temperatures fell outside those parameters and sunlight levels dropped below critical thresholds, the systems failed. Crops died in fields. Greenhouses designed for supplemental production rather than primary food sources couldn't compensate for the loss of open-air farming. Within weeks, Earth's food production had dropped by more than 70%. Within months, it approached near total collapse in many regions. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Earth, which had fed much of the solar system through its massive agricultural output, now couldn't feed itself. The planet that exported food to Mars, too, the belt, to the outer colonies, now faced the prospect of mass starvation. The infrastructure existed to produce food at scale, but the environmental conditions necessary for that infrastructure to function had been destroyed by the bombardment. 30 billion mouths needed feeding, and the systems that had sustained them for generations no longer worked. The food that remained became the most valuable commodity on Earth almost overnight. Government stockpiles, originally maintained for emergencies, proved woefully inadequate for a crisis of this magnitude. They could sustain some fraction of the population for some period of time, but not all 30 billion for the years it would take to recover agricultural capacity. Distribution networks that had efficiently moved food from production centers to population centers broke down under the strain of managing scarcity rather than abundance. The logistics of feeding billions when you don't have enough food becomes a series of impossible choices about who eats and who starves. The basic assistance system, already struggling before the bombardment, collapsed entirely in most regions. The government simply lacked the resources to maintain the guaranteed survival that BASIC had promised. People who had lived their entire lives depending on government food distribution suddenly found themselves without access to nutrition. The stockpiles were redirected to essential workers, to those whose labor was critical for survival and recovery efforts, to the military and emergency services, those on BASIC. The majority of Earth's population were left to forage, to rely on whatever informal networks they could find, or to simply wait for starvation to claim them. The death toll from starvation exceeded even the immediate casualties from the impacts themselves. Billions died not from the violence of falling asteroids, but from the slow agony of malnutrition and hunger. The process took months, stretching out the horror as bodies consumed themselves, as immune systems failed, as people simply wasted away. In some regions, particularly those far from the impact sites where physical damage was minimal, the majority of deaths came not from the bombardment itself, but from the famine that followed. The radiation poisoning that spread from the impact zones added another dimension to Earth's suffering. The asteroids had struck with such force that they'd created radioactive isotopes in the impacted material, and these isotopes were now spreading through the environment. Water supplies became contaminated as groundwater absorbed radioactive particles. The air itself carried radioactive dust, particularly in regions downwind from the impact sites. People who had survived the impacts and the initial famine found themselves sickening from radiation exposure, their bodies breaking down from invisible damage. The medical system, overwhelmed by the scale of the casualties, could provide only minimal treatment for radiation sickness. The sophisticated healthcare that Earth's civilization had taken for granted required infrastructure, power, medical supplies, and trained personnel, all of which were in desperately short supply after the bombardment. Hospitals in less affected regions were flooded with refugees from the impact zones, far exceeding their capacity to provide care. Triage became the norm, with medical personnel forced to choose who would receive treatment and who would be left to die, because resources couldn't possibly stretch to cover everyone in need. The refugee crisis created by the bombardment represented one of the largest movements of people in human history. Hundreds of millions fled the impact zones and the areas rendered uninhabitable by radiation. They traveled toward regions that had suffered less damage, regions that theoretically could still support human life. But those regions lacked the capacity to absorb such enormous populations. Cities that had held 10 million suddenly needed to accommodate 50 million. The infrastructure couldn't handle the load. Housing, sanitation, Food distribution, all the systems that make urban life possible, broke down under the strain. The movement of refugees also spread the catastrophe's effects beyond the immediate impact zones. People fleeing contaminated areas brought radioactive particles with them on their clothing, in their bodies. They brought diseases that flourished in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the refugee camps. They brought trauma and desperation that sometimes manifested in violence when resources grew scarce. The breakdown of social order that began in the impact zones spread with the refugees, as desperate people did desperate things to survive. Earth's government struggled to maintain any semblance of control over this cascading disaster. The loss of Secretary General Gao had created a leadership vacuum at the worst possible moment. Avasarala's assumption of leadership, while providing some continuity, came as she inherited a situation that might simply be beyond any leader's ability to manage. The decisions she faced were impossible. Which regions to prioritize for aid? Which populations to effectively abandon? How to allocate resources when all allocations meant condemning millions to death through scarcity? The military found its role transformed by the crisis. The United Nations Navy, built to project power across the solar system, was redirected to relief operations and internal security. Warships became supply transports, carrying what food could be gathered from less affected regions to population centers facing starvation. Marines trained for assault operations found themselves manning checkpoints, distributing rations, and attempting to maintain order among populations that had lost everything. The skills that made them effective warriors proved largely irrelevant to the tasks they now faced. The dependence on external aid became humiliatingly clear as Earth's crisis deepened. Mars, despite the diplomatic tensions created by the stealth technology issue, did provide some assistance. Martian supply ships began arriving with food produced in their underground agricultural facilities. It wasn't nearly enough to solve Earth's crisis, but it prevented some number of deaths and demonstrated that not everyone in the solar system was willing to simply watch humanity's homeworld collapse. The political implications were complex, with Earth forced into the position of supplicant to a colony it had once dominated. But survival trumped pride. More surprisingly, some Belter factions also provided aid. Despite the Belt's long-standing grievances against Earth, despite the fact that one of their own had orchestrated the bombardment, many Belters recognized that allowing billions to starve served no constructive purpose. Ships began arriving from Belt stations carrying supplies, often organized through private initiatives rather than official OPA channels. The assistance was modest compared to the scale of need, but it represented a crucial acknowledgement that humanity's various factions remained connected despite their conflicts. The economic collapse that accompanied the physical disaster fundamentally restructured what remained of Earth's society. The currency systems that had governed economic activity for centuries lost meaning when the primary concern became physical survival rather than wealth accumulation. Barter economies emerged in regions where government control had weakened. Food, water, medicine, and power became the real currencies, while the financial instruments that had once represented wealth became worthless pieces of data. The employed class, which had enjoyed significant advantages over those on basic before the bombardment, found their positions increasingly precarious. Many of the jobs that had defined employment no longer existed or no longer mattered. The distinction between employed and basic blurred, as both groups faced the same fundamental challenges of finding food and shelter. The social hierarchy that had defined Earth's civilization for generations began to collapse, not because anyone chose to dismantle it, but because the conditions that sustained it no longer existed. In some regions, particularly those that had suffered less direct damage and retained some functional infrastructure, alternative social arrangements began emerging. Communities organized themselves for mutual survival, pooling resources and labor in ways that bore little resemblance to Earth's pre-bombardment society. These emergent structures were often more egalitarian than what had come before, born from the recognition that survival required cooperation, and that old distinctions of status and wealth meant little when everyone faced the same existential threats. The psychological trauma of the bombardment and its aftermath affected everyone who lived through it, creating mental health crises that compounded the physical challenges. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD became endemic among survivors who had witnessed unimaginable death and destruction. The loss of familiar structures, of routine and normalcy, of the future that people had expected, created a kind of existential despair that went beyond the immediate threats to physical survival. Many people simply gave up, losing the will to continue fighting for survival in a world that seemed to have ended. Children suffered particularly acutely from this psychological dimension of the crisis. Those who had grown up with the expectation that Earth, despite its problems, provided basic security and predictable futures, suddenly found themselves in a world of chaos and death. The trauma of witnessing parents and siblings die from starvation or radiation sickness, of living in refugee camps or ruined cities, of experiencing constant fear and uncertainty, would mark an entire generation. The long-term psychological consequences of the bombardment would persist for decades, shaping Earth's society long after the immediate physical crises were addressed. The question of how Earth would recover, or whether it could recover at all, dominated discussions among those with the luxury to think beyond immediate survival. The optimistic scenario involved slowly clearing the debris from the atmosphere, restoring agricultural production, rebuilding infrastructure, and eventually returning to something approximating pre-bombardment conditions. But even the optimistic projections suggested this would take decades at minimum, possibly generations. And those projections assumed no further catastrophes, no additional attacks or crises that would set back recovery efforts. The pessimistic scenario, which many considered more realistic, envisioned Earth entering a permanent state of diminished capacity. The planet might stabilize at a lower population level, perhaps 10 or 15 billion rather than 30 billion, with the excess dying off through starvation, disease, and the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The society that emerged from this die-off would be fundamentally different from what had come before, possibly more decentralized, certainly more focused on basic survival than on projecting power or maintaining dominance in the solar system. Some analysts went further, suggesting that Earth's time as the center of human civilization had ended. Mars, unaffected by the bombardment and continuing its methodical advancement toward full habitability, would inevitably surpass Earth in importance. The colony worlds beyond the ring gates, offering opportunities that devastated Earth could never match, would draw the ambitious and capable, leaving behind only those unable to emigrate. Earth might persist as a backwater, its glory days permanently behind it, a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization, rather than the beating heart of humanity's expansion into space. The bombardment also fundamentally altered Earth's strategic position. Before the attack, Earth's dominance rested on its massive population, its industrial capacity, and its military might. After the attack, all three pillars were compromised. The population, while still large, was starving and traumatized rather than productive. The industrial capacity had been severely damaged, with critical facilities destroyed or rendered inoperable. And the military, while still formidable in absolute terms, was stretched impossibly thin, managing internal crises rather than projecting power externally. This weakening of Earth emboldened other actors in the solar system. The Free Navy, having demonstrated Earth's vulnerability, pressed its advantage by continuing to interdict shipping and maintain control over belt resources. Mars, while not directly hostile, became less deferential to Earth's preferences, more willing to pursue independent policies regardless of UN objections. Even smaller powers began asserting themselves, recognizing that Earth's ability to enforce its will had been dramatically reduced by the catastrophe. The environmental parallel between the bombardment and the climate crisis of 2 centuries earlier was not lost on Earth's survivors. Twice now, Earth had been pushed to the brink of civilizational collapse. The first time through humanity's own recklessness in managing the planet's ecosystem. The second time, through deliberate attack from an external enemy. Both crises revealed the same fundamental truth, that even the mightiest civilization remains vulnerable to catastrophic disruption, that the systems sustaining billions of lives can break down with shocking speed, that survival cannot be taken for granted, no matter how advanced your technology or sophisticated your organization. The 6 months of continued asteroid attacks that followed the initial bombardment, while less devastating than the first 3 impacts, maintained constant pressure on Earth's defensive capabilities and prevented meaningful progress toward recovery. Each new attack required resources for interception, demanded attention from military forces that might otherwise assist with relief operations, and perpetuated the psychological trauma of living under siege. The bombardment had become a war of attrition, with Marco Inaros apparently determined to ensure Earth couldn't recover before the Free Navy consolidated its control over the belt. The radiation that would persist in the impact zones for decades represented a permanent loss of habitable territory. Regions that had supported hundreds of millions of people before the bombardment would remain essentially uninhabitable for generations. The land itself had been poisoned, the soil contaminated to depths that would require centuries to naturally purge. Even when the debris cloud cleared and temperatures returned to normal ranges, Even when agricultural production could resume in less affected regions, the impact zones themselves would remain as scars. Dead zones where nothing could live without suffering the slow death of radiation poisoning. As we reach the end of the television series timeline, Earth remains in crisis. The immediate catastrophe of the bombardment has stabilized somewhat, with the worst of the die-off complete and survivors beginning to adapt to new realities. But the planet is fundamentally diminished, its population reduced, its power compromised, its future uncertain. The Earth that emerges from this crisis will not be the Earth that entered it. The bombardment has forced a transformation as profound as the climate crisis did centuries earlier, and the final shape of that transformation remains unclear. The conclusion. As we've journeyed through the complex reality of Earth in the expanse, from its environmental recovery to its massive population, to its dominant military, to its catastrophic bombardment, we've seen a world that embodies both humanity's greatest achievements and its most profound failures. Now, as we prepare to conclude this exploration, it's worth stepping back to consider what Earth's story tells us about power, survival, and the fragility of civilization. Earth's role in the solar system's political landscape has always been complicated by its unique position. As the only naturally habitable world in human space, at least until the ring gates opened access to exoplanets, Earth possessed an inherent importance that transcended its government's competence or its military's strength. No matter how powerful Mars became, no matter how much the belt chafed under Earth's dominance, the home world of humanity retained a symbolic and practical significance that couldn't be eliminated. This significance derived partly from simple demographics. With 30 billion people, Earth represented the overwhelming majority of humanity. Decisions made on Earth affected more humans than decisions made anywhere else. The UN government, despite its flaws and its disconnection from much of its population, spoke for more people than any other institution in history. This gave Earth's leadership a kind of democratic legitimacy, however attenuated, that Mars's more efficient but smaller government or the belt's fragmented political structures couldn't match. But Earth's political role also stemmed from its function as humanity's breadbasket, the planet's massive agricultural capacity. Even after the environmental damage of the climate crisis, produced surplus food sufficient to feed not just its own population, but significant portions of the populations of Mars and the Belt. This made Earth's stability a concern for everyone in the solar system, not just Earthers themselves. A crisis on Earth meant food shortages elsewhere, meant supply chain disruptions, meant potential starvation in communities that had no agricultural capacity of their own. The bombardment demonstrated this interdependence in the starkest possible terms. When Earth's agricultural systems collapsed, the effects rippled throughout human space. Ganymede's agricultural domes, already damaged by earlier fighting, couldn't compensate for the loss of Earth's production. Mars's underground farms produced enough for Martians, but not for export. Belt communities that had imported food from Earth for generations suddenly faced shortages that threatened their own survival. The attack on Earth was, in a very real sense, an attack on all of humanity's food security. This realization prompted responses that might have seemed unlikely before the crisis. Martians and Belters, who had plenty of reasons to resent Earth and might have been expected to welcome its humbling, instead provided aid because they recognized that allowing Earth to completely collapse would threaten everyone. The interconnectedness of human civilization, which had often been a source of exploitation and resentment, became a reason for mutual support in crisis. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark time, a suggestion that humanity's various factions might be capable of recognizing their common interests, even amid their conflicts. The political implications of Earth's weakening extend beyond the immediate crisis of the bombardment. For generations, the fundamental dynamic of solar system politics had been Earth's dominance, balanced against Mars's technological sophistication and the Belt's resource control. This three-way tension, while often manifesting in conflict, had created a kind of stability through mutually checked ambitions. Earth couldn't simply impose its will on Mars because Martian military technology made the cost prohibitive. Mars couldn't dominate the Belt because it lacked the population and industrial capacity to control such vast territory. The Belt couldn't achieve full independence because it remained dependent on Earth and Mars for essential goods. The bombardment disrupted this balance, weakening Earth to the point where the old equilibrium no longer held. Mars, unaffected by the attacks, suddenly became relatively more powerful than it had been. The Belt, or at least the Free Navy portion of it, had demonstrated it could strike devastating blows against the old superpower. The political situation was in flux, with no clear indication of what new, stable configuration might emerge. Would Mars leverage its improved position to dominate both Earth and the Belt? Would the Free Navy's success inspire other Belt factions to even more aggressive assertion of independence? Would Earth, humbled but not destroyed, eventually recover its strength and reassert dominance? The opening of the ring gates complicated these political calculations immeasurably. Suddenly, the question wasn't just about who controlled the solar system, but about who would control humanity's expansion to the stars. The colony worlds beyond the gates represented opportunities and resources that dwarfed anything available in the solar system. Control over access to these worlds, over the logistics of colonization, over the establishment of new political structures in new star systems, became the central political struggle of the era. Earth's leadership, particularly under Avasarala, recognized that the ring gates represented both opportunity and threat. Opportunity because they offered a pressure valve for Earth's enormous population, a place where billions might emigrate to find better lives than Earth could offer. Threat because mass emigration would further weaken Earth's primary strategic asset, its population base, and would likely result in those emigrants owing no loyalty to their world of origin. The homeworld might become increasingly irrelevant as humanity spread to more hospitable environments. Mars faced similar calculations, but from a different starting position. The Martian dream of terraforming, the multi-generational project that had united Martian society and given it purpose, suddenly seemed less necessary when thousands of already habitable worlds were available. Why spend generations transforming Mars when you could simply move to a world that was already Earth-like? This question threatened the very foundation of Martian identity and social cohesion, potentially unraveling the civilization that Mars had spent 2 centuries building. For the Belt, the ring gates represented both liberation and loss. Liberation because they offered new opportunities beyond the exploitation-based economy that had defined Belt life for generations. Loss because much of the Belt's strategic importance derived from controlling the solar system's resources, and that importance would diminish as colony worlds provided alternative resource bases. The Belt's independence movement, having achieved some of its goals through the Free Navy's actions, now had to contend with the reality that independence might mean independence from an economic system that was becoming obsolete. The series leaves many of these political questions unresolved, which is appropriate for a story that values complexity over neat conclusions. But the trajectory seems clear enough. Earth's time as the unquestioned center of human civilization is ending. Whether this transition happens peacefully or violently, whether Earth adapts to a new role or attempts to maintain its dominance through force, whether humanity's various factions find ways to cooperate in expanding to the stars, or whether old conflicts simply transplant themselves to new worlds. All of these questions remain open as the series concludes. What we can say with certainty is that Earth's story in The Expanse serves as a powerful exploration of how civilizations rise, dominate, and eventually decline. The planet that survived environmental near catastrophe through desperate unification, that built the largest navy in history, that governed 30 billion people for centuries, proved vulnerable to attack from enemies it had dismissed as inferior. The superpower that seemed invincible was, in the end, terrifyingly fragile. Its strength built on foundations that could be shattered by determined opponents with the right weapons and tactics. This vulnerability reflects a deeper truth that The Expanse consistently emphasizes: that no amount of power, no level of technological advancement, no sophistication of political organization can eliminate the fundamental precariousness of civilization. Complex systems, whether ecological or social or economic, can break down with shocking speed. The stability we take for granted is always temporary, always dependent on conditions that could change. Earth's fall from dominance to desperate survival happened in a matter of hours. A reminder that catastrophe often comes without warning and without mercy. Yet the series also shows us that even after catastrophic failure, even after billions of deaths and the collapse of familiar structures, humanity persists. Earth, wounded and diminished, continues. Its people, traumatized and struggling, survive. The civilization that seemed to have ended instead adapts, finding new ways to organize, new purposes to pursue, new reasons to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. This resilience, this stubborn refusal to surrender to despair even in the darkest circumstances, represents something admirable in the human spirit that the Expanse celebrates, even as it never shies away from depicting humanity's darker aspects. The Earth we've explored tonight is not the Earth of optimistic science fiction, where humanity has solved its problems and reached for the stars from a position of triumph. It's an Earth that barely survived its own near destruction, that built its dominance on foundations of environmental damage and social inequality, that maintained its power through a combination of military might and the absence of alternatives, rather than through genuine superiority. It's an Earth that, when tested, proved unable to protect even itself, let alone the far-flung populations that depended on it. But it's also an Earth populated by people like Christian Avasarala, who refuse to give up even when everything seems lost. It's an Earth where billions of ordinary people survive under impossible conditions, maintain their humanity in the face of horror, and continue hoping for something better. It's an Earth that, despite all its flaws and failures, remains the cradle of humanity, the world where our species first achieved consciousness and first looked up at the stars with wonder and ambition. The story of Earth in the Expanse is ultimately a story about home, about what it means to belong to a place, even when that place is broken, about the ties that bind us to our origins, even when we've spread across the solar system and beyond. It's about the weight of history, about how the choices of previous generations constrain the options available to those who come after. It's about power and its limits, about strength and its fragility, about dominance and its inevitable erosion. As humanity continues its expansion into the cosmos, as new civilizations are established on colony worlds beyond the ring gates, Earth's importance will likely continue to diminish. It will become one world among thousands, its special status as humanity's homeworld increasingly abstract rather than practical. Future generations, born on distant worlds, will look back at Earth as ancient history, as a place their ancestors came from, rather than a place they have any meaningful connection to. The Earth we've explored tonight will become legend, a story about where humanity began, rather than a living, breathing reality. But for now, in the era that the Expanse depicts, Earth remains central to humanity's story. Its survival or collapse matters not just to the 30 billion people who call it home, but to everyone, everywhere who shares in humanity's common heritage. The wounded planet, struggling to recover from its self-inflicted environmental damage and from the deliberate attack that nearly finished what climate change had started represents both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about how quickly the mighty can fall, how vulnerable even the strongest civilizations remain to catastrophic disruption. An inspiration in its refusal to surrender, in its determination to survive and rebuild, in its stubborn insistence that the story of humanity's homeworld is not yet finished. As we conclude this exploration of Earth in the Expanse, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and thoughtfulness with which the series approaches its depiction of humanity's future. This is science fiction that takes seriously the consequences of our choices, that doesn't offer easy solutions to difficult problems, that presents a future that feels earned rather than simply imagined. Earth's story, with all its tragedy and triumph, feels real in a way that much speculative fiction doesn't, grounded in recognizable human nature and plausible extrapolations from our present circumstances. If you've enjoyed this deep examination of Earth in the Expanse, if you've found value in exploring how this series builds its world and develops its themes, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps tremendously and lets me know that you want more content exploring the intricate universes of science fiction that capture our imaginations and make us think about our own world in new ways. The story of Earth reminds us that our choices matter, that the problems we leave unsolved become the crises our descendants must face, that power is always temporary and should be wielded with humility rather than arrogance. It reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, that civilization is fragile, that the stability we take for granted could evaporate in an instant. But it also reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, humanity has the capacity to persevere, to adapt, to find hope in the rubble of broken dreams. Thank you for joining me on this journey to humanity's wounded cradle, to the Earth of the Expanse, where billions struggle beneath compromised skies. May we learn from its mistakes, be inspired by its resilience, and recognize in its story something of our own precarious position on this pale blue dot we call home. Until next time, rest well, and remember that the future we build begins with the choices we make today. Good night.